everybody, and welcome back from your break that is over. I'm going to give everybody just a couple seconds to come back in from the back corners, and hopefully you're using all the bathrooms, not just the ladies' rooms, and we can get started again. It's been really, really great to see this room full all day long for 2 days, and also to see how hard it is to get everybody to sit back down because you want to keep talking to each other after 2 days, but you got to stop talking to each other. Hi, how are you? Okay, next up, am I supposed to introduce myself? That's right. Hi, I'm Lauren McLean. I'm a member of the Boise City Council, and I am so honored and proud to be a member also of the Board of Governors for the Andrus Center, and to welcome all of you back, and to thank you all for being here for this, what is this, our fourth conference on women in leadership here in Boise, Idaho. So thank you very much, and welcome back. Next up, we're going to hear from another wonderful guest who's joined us for these last 2 days, named Susan Sokol Blosser. I first actually heard of Susan, or I guess your last name really, when I was, the first time I ever drove to the Oregon coast to go crabbing with friends from Boise. And we drove through McMinnville, I think, and then I saw this really interesting name on a sign linked to wine. And I got very curious about it, and we didn't have time to stop that time, but we went home, I tracked down the wine, and the next year we went crabbing again, and I stopped in the winery and loved Susan's wine. And so when we heard today that she was going to come and talk about entrepreneurship and other things, I first want to say I thought she was going to be talking about wine, but there's so much more to Susan than the award-winning wine that has come out of her vineyard. And you'll hear some of that today. And what's really important, and that her talk is called, is her business philosophy. I think that's made not only her good wine into a successful business, but has really guided her life when she thinks about how to give back to her community. And that is that you must be gracious and ruthless. So since she's arrived in Boise, we've spent some time together. We actually had breakfast both mornings, and I've really enjoyed the time with her. But I've only seen the gracious side. But I've had a really fun time imagining that ruthless side that must have helped her be so successful in business, because she's been such a success. As the founder of Sokol Blosser Wines, she was actually a pioneer in the winemaking business and turning winemaking into a well-known industry in Oregon. And you know, we think of winemaking in Oregon as you think of the Willamette and the great Pinots and everything that's come out of it, that it's been there forever. But Susan and her then husband were one of the first 4 families to really pioneer, settle, and think about how to make wine and grow grapes in a place like Oregon, which you'd think would be pretty tough. Since, I guess in the last couple years, she still lives on the vineyard, but she's handed control of the business over to 2 of her 3 children. She has a 3rd child who lives in Portland. And now she's focused on taking everything she learned as a businesswoman and creating organizations and opportunities for the community that has been her home. So she's launched something called YES, the Yamhill Enrichment Society. And I just love the name, and she handed me this brochure with this great graphic, but it just made me think about all these people in the Yamhill Valley that must be so engaged in their community because they love the place that they live. But it's taken her commitment to sustainability and put it into real-world works of good within the Yamhill area and the Dundee Hills. And they focus on arts education, food and ag, and history and community. And some of the things that she told me about that they've created are programs to make sure that every child, when born in the area, go home from the hospital with books and get books for the first couple years of their life every month, which I think is such a cool program. just thinking of that basket of books that goes home from the hospital or the birthing center, and then the book that keeps coming in the mail to grow that library for kids who wouldn't otherwise have a library of books by the time they get to kindergarten. She told me about creating food systems, and an event that I think all of you should look into is the last weekend in August. They've created an event that celebrates local farms, local chefs, and local wines to support all of the good work around sustainability that she's now doing in the Yamhill area. So with that, I'd ask you to welcome Susan to the stage as she talks about her business philosophy, and I look forward to opening the next bottle of wine and really, instead of just tasting the fruit and everything else, a little taste of tones of ruthlessness and all that grace that goes into every bottle. So thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. I didn't expect such a great plug for the Yamhill Enrichment Society. This 2 days has really been extraordinary. I want to say kudos to the Andrus Center for putting together a really thought-provoking and interesting, diverse combination of speakers. I've really loved it. And you've really engaged us in some difficult and ultimately disturbing issues. I want to offer you a perspective that maybe is something of an antidote to that, a little focus on some of the positive changes. 10 years ago, for example, who could have imagined a black president? Who could have imagined that gay marriage would be publicly accepted? Who could have imagined women moving into leadership positions in every arena, including athletics, business, education, and government? I want to focus on this last, on gender equality, where the changes have been exciting to me and to other women of my generation, particularly, who have fought hard for them. The world in which we live is so much different from that of our mothers, and our new opportunities have made life much more complex. So today, you all, as professional women, face the challenge of not only climbing the career ladder, where you now have more opportunities than ever, but also balancing family demands from all sides, from your spouse, from your kids, even from your aging parents, and still finding space for you. I know from experience how hard that is. So I don't want to leave out the men in the audience, because the societal changes we're seeing also involve you. As men and women share more household responsibilities, you face the same challenges. But I'm addressing these concerns from a woman's point of view and focusing on business because that's my experience. But they apply equally to men who also find themselves operating in a world very different from their fathers. We are living in a historic time to be a woman. Whatever you think of Hillary Clinton, whether you love her or hate her, she has broken through the steel, not the glass ceiling of presidential politics. This is a defining moment happening in our lifetime. The same ceiling cracks are happening in every realm, which are starting to break open for women. First, let me point out that our being here today, a room full of professional people who are primarily female in decision-making roles, is in itself historic. Could this have happened 10 years ago? I don't think so. This gathering, the Andrus Center's Women in Leadership Conference, is only in its 4th year. Going back to the early 20th century, if we were a room full of women in the business world, we would have been telephone operators or seamstresses. And if we were a gathering of women leaders, we would all have been volunteer leaders in local charitable organizations. We have come a long way. Women have become a force in the business world, and a recent study in the Business Journals group found that women-owned businesses are one of the largest and fastest growing subsegments in the US business market. I think it's one of the amazing feats of our generation. Yet, it's still a man's world. It may seem as if women suddenly burst on the scene, but being treated with respect and having power in the business world has been a work in progress for over a century. Women in the US were given the right to vote nationally in 1919, but Susan B. Anthony started working for it in the 1850s. This past April, I went to a gathering of women leaders in the wine industry called Women of the Vine Global Symposium, and it was a who's who of women in all facets of the wine business. A thirst for such an event must have existed because the event sold out with 650 women attending from all over the country. I met a few old friends there, fellow warriors in silk suits from back in the 1990s. We looked around in wonder at this gathering of businesswomen. We had each spent our careers as the only woman in the room. "We could have done this years ago," one commented, "only there would have been 5 of us." To give you more perspective on how far we've come, here are a few facts to keep in mind. In the 19th century, women started out belonging to their fathers. When they came of age, they belonged to their husbands. They couldn't own property in their own name. Even late in the 20th century, there were many laws and customs that demonstrated the mindset that women were subject to male decision-making. For example, I got married in 1966, and I took my husband's name. I didn't think about it then. I didn't have a choice. Women were not only expected to take their husband's name, they had to. A woman couldn't legally keep her own name when she married. This became an issue in Oregon when State Senator Betty Roberts wanted to both marry and keep her name by which she was known professionally. She was so incensed at the existing law that she agitated to change it. It took her 2 legislative sessions to get a bill passed in the Oregon legislature, and today it's hard to imagine this as such a controversial issue. But after failing in previous sessions, when it finally passed in 1973, it was only by 2 votes. And it was not until the end of the 20th century that women could own credit cards in their own name rather than as a subset of their husband's card. When I look back, I realize all the conflicting messages I was given about who I should be as a woman. Maybe you can relate to some of these. I watched Hollywood movies, which were all about catching a husband and living happily ever after. Sometimes the female lead was a strong career woman, but she melted when she found the right man and gave up her career. The message was clear. Careers were fine, but woman's place was in the home, raising kids and providing a safe haven for her hard-working husband. Having both a career and a family was not an option. My mother was a good example. She was a concert violinist who was making more money than her husband when she got married. She stopped working when she got pregnant with her first child in 1930. It wasn't simply about taking care of her child. She had live-in help. It was about following expectations. This is what women did. I look now at the work she put into her artistry and what she had achieved, and it saddens me to think about what she was expected and what she accepted as normal to give up. I learned early that boys were treated differently. I played every girls' sport available. I was on all the teams. No one in my family came to my games, but my mother made sure we went to all my brother's games. My mother wasn't unusual. She was following the norm. Title IX, which leveled the playing fields for boys and girls sports by preventing sex discrimination in financing sports, was first passed in 1972. Powerful politicians tried repeatedly to nullify it with amendments, and it didn't become solidified legislatively until 1975. And women athletes of today owe their opportunities to that legislation, and as we learned last night, so do victims of sexual assault. My father had his own business, and talk at the dinner table often centered around the issues he faced. I heard it all, but it was clear he was talking to my brothers and not me. I never dreamed I would end up being a business owner myself. On the other hand, I grew up with 3 older brothers and knew they weren't any smarter than I was. I loved school, got good grades, and was encouraged by my teachers. I went to a girls' school and remember the time in grade school when one of my teachers looked me in the eye and told me I was given a good brain and it was my duty to use it. I took that seriously. When I got to college in the 1960s, I discovered that male students had no restrictions, but female students had what were called social regulations. We had to sign out if we left the dorm for the evening and say where we were going and with whom, even if we were only going to study at the library, and then sign back in before 10 o'clock on weekdays and midnight on weekends. The 1960s turned out to be a decade of protest against convention and the start of pretty radical change on many fronts. By the time I graduated, women's social regulations were a thing of the past. But that was just the beginning. By the time my son went to college, co-ed dorms had become the norm. Our 1960s protests against social regulations for women only, were part of a trend that changed gender relations. This was the start of redefining men and women's roles. As women breaking new ground, we had to learn what equality looked like. It took a lot of experimentation. Professional women were out to prove we were just as good as men. So in the 1970s and 80s, we started by trying to be just like the guys, to fit into the business world by being more male-like. We even started to dress like businessmen. Pantsuits came into vogue, and many women even wore little ties. A black business suit became as much of a professional wardrobe necessity as the little black dress. For a more casual professional look, we wore blazers and button-down shirts. Women who were able to rise to managerial positions tried to act like the men of authority they replaced and used authoritarian male tactics. In other words, leadership based on rank. Men seemed to take on dominant roles easily, but when women tried it outside the home, they sounded shrill, overly harsh, and were labeled bitchy. Men could yell, swear, and pound the table without recrimination. It was accepted as normal. Women couldn't get away with it. So professional women faced a dilemma. If you didn't speak out in a meeting, men thought you were there to refill their coffee cups. If you spoke out timidly, you were ignored. And if you spoke loudly, you risked being labeled the bitch. Was it possible to find a happy medium? We were still finding our way. There were also women who tried the weaker sex technique. Rather than fight for equality, they tried to get ahead through feminine wiles, often using sex. Not only did this not get them male respect, but it was also only short-term success. When their allure faded, so did their influence. For the majority of women who sought true equality, it took years to learn how to navigate successfully and lead from strength, to be true to ourselves as women and still be taken seriously in the male world of business. I like to think we've finally figured it out. Today's businesswoman knows she can look professional whatever she wears. Our daughters have expanded the fight, and I think we're in a good place to be female and still be successful. It hasn't been easy, and we are a work in progress, but I see hope. What happened is that we have faced the reality that we are not just like the guys. We are different. So, what does separate but equal mean for women? We know what men are good at. What are female strengths? There's been a lot of research, so here's what we know. Helen Fisher, a professor at Rutgers University, studied gender relations and compiled a number of scientific studies documenting biological and psychological differences between men and women. I'm going to quote from her book, which is called The First Sex. And when you hear these traits, you might say to yourself, yes, of course, I know all that, but I'll bet you didn't know these applied to business. Dr. Fisher found that women have exceptional inborn talents bred deeply in history. They are different from those of men. Women's are a talent with words, a capacity to read postures, gestures, facial expressions, and other nonverbal cues, emotional sensitivity, empathy, excellent senses of touch, taste, smell, and hearing, patience, an ability to do and think several things simultaneously. Women's capacity for what is called peripheral vision, the ability to be making dinner while watching the kids and still answer the phone, is legendary. A broad contextual view of any issue, a penchant for long-term planning, a gift for networking and negotiating, an impulse to nurture, and here's what I think is key, a preference for cooperating, reaching consensus, and leading via egalitarian terms. Men have a passion for rank, women for connection. Now, not all women have every one of these, and men have them in varying degree, but the studies show there are gender differences, and these are women's potential talents. Dr. Fisher ends her book with this statement: "It is time to honor our gender differences, enable women's natural talents to flourish in the workplace, build new understanding between men and women, and work together. Without this fundamental collaboration, both sexes are cheated. Society is cheated too. Women have become an enormous economic and social asset." This was a radical statement in 1999 when her book was published. I hope it sounds normal today and you are saying to yourself, of course, that's the way it should be. One of the things you might have noticed about this list of women's talents is that they are more of what is commonly called touchy-feely traits than one associates with business. Business has a reputation for being tough, cutthroat competition, win at all costs. How can a woman use her inborn talents in such a world? In my experience, I believe it's possible. Our first vintage at Sokol Blosser Winery was 1977. I spent the decade of the 1970s having 3 children, working part-time jobs, and running the winery's tasting room on weekends. In 1980, when my husband, who had been working elsewhere, was able to come in full-time as president, I didn't want to work under him, so I moved and managed the vineyards. Then after 10 years, my husband was burned out trying to convince the world to buy Oregon Pinot Noir. He went back to his previous job, and I took over as president of the company. I ran the vineyards and winery for the next 17, and then transitioned control to my children, who have been running the business since 2008. My story is that of a liberal arts graduate with few skills who learned how to run a successful business, be competitive, and stay true to myself and my values. One of the things the Business Journal study discovered was that women business owners hold a unique, what they call work-values balance, that is statistically different from male business owners. Women strive for financial success, but even more important is the inherent meaning of their work. Women owners want and need to be engaged in work that is personally satisfying and fulfilling. I found that exactly describes how I look at my work. While I was president at Sokol Blosser Winery, I kept a notebook of things I observed and learned as I found my way. I compiled them as 12 short essays in the book, which I entitled Gracious and Ruthless: Surprising Strategies for Business Success. It's my business philosophy, and I want to read a few of them to you. These are practical, experience-based recommendations on surviving and thriving in business. I really got the idea of writing it for other small business owners because I think we are a special niche in the business world, but I think much of what I say applies to managers and actually life in general. So I want to start out by talking about this concept of gracious and ruthless. It's not gracious but ruthless, it's gracious and ruthless. After I passed along the full-time management of Sokol Blosser Winery to my children, I had time to look back and reflect on what I'd learned over all my years in the business. It was then that I realized, with some surprise, that combining two apparently opposed ways of being, gracious and ruthless, had been the key to survival and success for me. People look at me with a mixture of confusion and astonishment when I talk about combining these two, so let me explain. The concept of being simultaneously gracious and ruthless is startling because these two words are not usually paired. I will argue they are not only complementary, they are a critical counterbalance. You must be both. If you are gracious only, you will quickly be rubbed out in the business world. If you are ruthless only, you will be perceived as a nasty person and no one will want to do business with you. Combine the two and you will be powerful and classy. Think of it as doing business with heart and a hard hat. You may rail against the idea of being ruthless. Get over it. Ruthlessness is the quality that allows you to face your toughest decisions squarely and dispassionately, without emotional bias, and move forward. It points you to what you know is best, even when it is hard and appears heartless. It enables you to fire an employee who isn't performing, even though everyone likes him. It's the quality that keeps you focused on your vision. I don't equate ruthless with cruel. I do equate it with unemotional and detached. It is the classic matter-of-fact, business-first approach. Gracious balances ruthless by adding compassion and tact. Gracious means you carry out your decisions with consideration of others. It's not synonymous with charm, which can be an act flicked on like a light bulb when useful. Graciousness comes from within and shows a generous heart. Being gracious as well as ruthless means compassionately considering others' feelings while taking necessary action. This skill set may be touched on in business schools under the heading Maximizing the Workforce, but that dehumanizes what is a very personal approach and genuine, not manipulative. You are ruthless because you are protecting your business. That connection is easy to make. Gracious is more complex. Being gracious is a choice you make, understanding that being courteous and thoughtful to others helps you sleep better at night, will come back to you in the long run, and sets your style as a leader and an example to your employees. Combining gracious and ruthless and keeping them in equilibrium takes practice. I see I have my 5-minute warning, so I'm going to stop with that. I actually had 2 other things I was going to read to you. I didn't realize I was speaking so long. This year, I will celebrate my 72nd birthday. Thank you. That is an accomplishment to have survived this long. I'm one of the women who started out wearing pantsuits and blazers because I wanted to look professional. I colored my hair when it started to turn gray because I was advised that while gray hair made men look distinguished, it made women look old and dumpy. I spent hours at the hair salon getting my dark roots colored so I would be taken seriously in the male business world. It was only after I had proved myself as a business leader that I finally had the confidence to go totally gray. It was a liberating experience. We are living in an exciting time to be a professional woman. Doors have opened, your choices grow every day. I hope you grab the opportunities as you recognize your innate strengths, develop and be true to them. You will do your best work when you are true to yourself. I have 3 favorite quotes to leave you with. First, any decision you make is not a decision about what to do, it's a decision about who you are. Secondly, life's challenges are not supposed to paralyze you. They're supposed to help you discover who you are. And third, the only place where success comes before work is in the dictionary. My wish for you is that you meet your challenges with a clear mind and a kind heart. Thank you.
No, it is. Great. Thank you, Susan. I'll be taking questions from the audience, so if you want to raise your hand, we'll pass them over. But while we're waiting for the first ones to come up, I'm wondering if you could actually talk, there's 2 things I think it would be great to hear you talk about, especially since we're in the year that we're in with a woman running for president. And in so many ways, she's that bridge from the world that was to the world that is now. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on possibly watching that along the way and Hillary's evolution. And then also if you have any examples of other people that we would know that you think exhibit grace and ruthlessness as you propose are so important to the business community or success in general.
Well, let me deal with the second question first. I sort of feel like I'm from the Gloria Steinem generation. And she was our model. She could be very gracious, but she also hit really hard at what she believed in. And, her famous quote that a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle, I'm sure you've all heard that. That was an inspiration to a lot of I personally hope Hillary becomes our next president. I think she obviously has the background. I just think it's really important that a woman become president. And just like, and I'll give you all my biases here, just like with any other top leadership position, the woman has to be twice the capacity of the man to get that position. And I've seen that happen over and over again. That's what's happening in the current presidential election, in my opinion, and I'm hoping she makes it. So there you are.
Thanks. I particularly appreciated your conversation about how men in the business world and now in the political world can, hit the desk and yell loud, and the same thing can't happen for women right now. And to that end, I wonder what your hopes are for future generations of women, both in the business world and the political world, and as community leaders.
Did you all hear the question?
Shoot, can people hear me? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm just used to asking that because so often people in the back don't. I see huge change. I see it in my sons. I have 2 sons. They do most of the cooking at home. Their wives are professionals. They are fathers in a manner that fathers never used to be, and are much more accepting of women of gender equality. That's really the way to put it. And their sons are going to be one step further in that. So I am tremendously optimistic in what's happening. And I guess it's all about options. And men and women ought to have the same options. So there you are.
Thank you. Okay, so there are a couple that I think are great follow-ups to that. I'm going to ask you both of them at the same time. Wait. The one, especially when you talk about your sons and the fathers or partners that they are, what would you say to men who feel marginalized by successful women?
Get over it.
All righty.
It's how you define marginalized. I mean, that makes an assumption that it carries an old school view of masculinity. And that's what you need to get over. The world has changed, and it's much more exciting for the changes, in my mind.
Thank you. What was your most ruthless act in business, and how did you practice grace during this action?
Oh, gosh. Well, one of the things, I don't consider this my most ruthless. I never actually thought about, what have I done that's the most ruthless? But I can give you an example that actually I have in my book, is that I decided that I would practice, see if I could be gracious and ruthless in saying no to donation requests. And the wine business, I think every entity that is raising money wants wine donations. I know that for a fact.
A lot of people in the audience want wine donations.
So I decided that I would follow Nancy Reagan and see if I could just say no. So I wanted to see if I could do it graciously. And what I did, because when I was president, they all came to me, and I'd usually get messages on my telephone. This is when we still got used telephones and got messages on them, I would call the person back, which often surprised them, which was a small but gracious move. And I would, because they were not paid solicitors, they were volunteers who really believed in what they were doing, I would thank them, and I would admire what they were doing, and then I'd say, no, I'm sorry, we're not able to donate. And they were always thankful that I'd taken time to call them. They understood, and I'd wish them luck. And I think we both had a good feeling about that transaction. But the important point was, I said no, because I could give it all away. And that was how I learned really to practice being both at the same time, because that is the secret to be ruthless and do it graciously from the heart.
Great, thanks. And to that, are there any particular exercises or experiences that you had that you think directly helped you develop this balance?
Well, I talk about different things in my book, giving examples, and I think the key thing is to ask yourself, when you're in a situation, start with the ruthless part, because that, for women particularly, is often the hardest. If I take a detached, unemotional view of this situation, what is it? What should I do? And then once you decide that, then you look at, well, for example, how would I like to be treated if you're saying no to somebody, or if you're firing somebody, or it's an interpersonal relation? How would I like to be treated? What would be gracious if I were on the receiving end? So sometimes that helps. But you look at these two, weighing them separately. You decide what is, in an unemotional way, what is it you should do, and then how would you approach this gracefully and graciously. And sometimes it's being ruthless and gracious to yourself. It's not always an interaction with other people. One of the things I wanted to read you, I didn't realize time went so fast, was when you get to the top, how do you know when to let go? And this was really a personal one for me, because that's sort of the position I was in when I decided to transition, to pass the baton to my kids. And that is being ruthless with yourself. Maybe it's time for me to step down. And then you look at that in an unemotional way. And then how do you do it? Graciously. Because it's important to be gracious to yourself too. I say that because I usually have to remind myself of that.
Do you think the battle or the experience or challenges you had within the wine industry, being a woman in a man's industry, was any different than the challenges you faced being a woman fighting for environmental change, social change, or even in any other woman that might be out there in traditional farming or other more traditional careers?
Well, farming is particularly male-dominated. And here's just one little story. In the 1980s, when I was managing the vineyard, we did a lot of cover crop experiments, because we realized we were losing a lot of soil if we clean cultivated, and the cover crops would hold the soil in place. And we did such good work, I did such good work, that we were given an award by the Soil and Water Conservation District, the local district, And Bill and I, my husband and I, went to this dinner where we were to be honored, and everybody came up to him and congratulated him on, and asked him questions about it. You know, and I just stood there. People were not intending, I mean, it was such a lesson to me, because the men who came up were not trying to be discriminatory. They just were, without trying. And I wanted to say, hey, I'm the one who did it, buddy, but I didn't. I smiled. And Bill answered all the questions. He could have said, my wife did this.
So on that, that's actually a perfect segue, I think, to this question, which is wondering if you faced any challenges when you transitioned from your husband's leadership to your leadership within your company, and what they were.
Well, yes. Some of the things that Lisa talked about yesterday morning when she said, have any of you had the experience of making a suggestion which everybody passes over, and then 10 minutes later the guy in the room makes the suggestion and everybody thinks it's brilliant? Well, I can't tell you how many times that's happened. And there just is, in business, an implicit bias towards men, and that still exists. So it's just something we have to face and work through, and time will make a difference. But yes, I mean, it still is a man's world. Men are important. I love men, they're important, but you know, we're important too.
And you know, I think that might have been referring to, and that was the question that I had for you actually. I think a lot of us have seen that article this week about the women that want to be in the room in the White House, and where they talked about the practice of listening, repeating, and giving credit to the woman that had the idea, and doing that over and over again in the circle till they were heard. And so I wonder if...
It's hard to do when you're the only woman in the room.
Right. That's a very, very good point. So it sounds like that's really, at the end of the day, what matters, is to make sure that there's more than one woman in the room, and that at the same time that we're thinking about moving ourselves forward, we think about how we can authentically help everybody else in the room move forward with us by that repetition.
So let me just say one thing about that. When I transitioned, passed the baton to two of my children, the big issue was which one of them would be president. Brother and sister, okay? Sister's the younger one, 6 years younger. When I gave them I gave my whole staff the Myers-Briggs, Alex and Allison is their name. I burst out laughing when I saw their scores because they were at opposite ends. Absolutely everything was opposite. We thought, wow, if we could just put them together, how awesome that would be. And in fact, that's what we did. They are co-presidents. But the way this has worked out over the years is that Alex is the winemaker and runs the vineyards. Allison is the CEO. I love it.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we need to take a 15-minute break. It's 5 after, so we're going to start right up at 20 after. But we need to get some people in here to reset the tables and add some things to your table that we're going to need for our last session. So take a potty break, get some water, and come back in 15 minutes.